This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. This episode is brought to you by GEA. Around the world, every second liter of beer is brewed with the aid of systems and processes from GEA because their solutions address even the smallest details of the brewing process. GEA's range of services include everything from engineering, manufacturing, delivery, installation, automation, servicing, and more. At GEA, their goal is to help brewers make more beer of the highest quality in a cost-efficient and sustainable manner. To learn more, visit GEA.com and be sure to follow the GEA Craft Brewing page on Facebook.
Hey everybody, it's John Hall, the senior editor of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, and I want to get right into it because my guest today is Ken Grossman, and if you don't know who he is, well, shame on you, but he is the founder of the Sierra Nevada Brewing Company, established in 1980. And his passion for good beer began when a friend showed him the basics of home brewing. He began brewing 5-gallon batches of beer on his own and soon became a proficient home brewer. In 1976, Ken opened his own store, the Homebrew Shop, and soon after began building a small brewery in the town of Chico, California. You all know that as Sierra Nevada. And Ken, thanks for being here.
Well, welcome. Thanks for the invitation.
I want to jump into some of those early days of home brewing because with your brewery in Chico, with the brewery in Mills River, it's so mind-bogglingly big. You're the third largest craft brewer in the country right now, by the BA definition. Do you miss the old days of just firing up the stove and doing 5 gallons at a time?
You know, we've since sort of recreated some of those small batch options. So I have a nano brewery in Chico that brews about a half barrel, so less than 15 gallons, and we fire that up many times a week. We're actually brewing on the nano on a regular basis, and then probably 15 years ago, I built a 10-barrel brewery in Chico, which was the same size I started Sierra Nevada with, 300-gallon batches, and we use that one all the time. And then when we built Mills River, we included a 20-barrel brew house. And so I'm involved in a lot of the R&D projects. We meet every week. We go over concepts. We brew test batches all the time. So I still get a chance to be involved in creating new beers and working with the team on developing concepts for the future and keeping things exciting.
You know, that's an interesting thing, the concepts for the future. So Hazy Little Thing is the new IPA that's out right now. We're in New York City right now in the lobby of the Ace Hotel because last night the Brewers Association held a media dinner and you poured Hazy Little Thing for the assembled masses, as it were. But you made a pretty clear point to say that this is not a New England IPA.
Right.
Can we get into that a little bit? Because that seems what everybody's chasing right now is this haze and chasing this one particular aesthetic, this one particular look for the beer, and coming out with something that's called Hazy Little Thing and having it be an IPA.
Yep.
The natural assumption would be New England IPA. So why aren't you classifying it as such?
So I guess just to go back a little bit in history. So when I first started brewing commercially in 1980, we really had some pretty hazy beers, and our consumer back in those days was really not used to seeing a beer that had, that you couldn't see through, essentially. And so we did what we could to figure out how to stabilize the beer. And back in those days, the haze was coming from, in some cases, high-protein malt. We were having to use malts that were really produced for adjunct lager brewing, so they had a higher level of protein than an ideal English-style pale malt would, or even a German style for that matter. So we figured out how to do that through mashing and eventually started filtering because we would have this variability in our haze. It wasn't as if we were consistently hazy. And we were bottle conditioning, and so we had that also causing various cloudiness issues at times. And so we got a lot of flack. And so we've ended up treating our pale ale in a manner that we still have yeast in it. It's still bottle conditioned, but we've really done a lot to clean up that haze. Well, now that people are starting to, I think, appreciate the fact that beers can not be clear and bright, and leaving some of the proteins in, leaving some of the yeast in does contribute to some mouthfeel, some roundness. And so we've been actually making some cloudy styles for many, many years. So we wanted
Cloudy styles of IPA, though?
Cloudy styles of IPA,
okay.
Yep, totally unfiltered. And even going to our Torpedo, which isn't cloudy, but it's not filtered either. So that's a beer that we're really relying on just cold conditioning to remove some of the proteins by settling. But we don't do any chill proofing as far as adding agents to remove those proteins. And so occasionally it can throw a little haze. In our Celebration Ale, same thing. We don't do any overly aggressive treatment to remove that. So we have hazy batches of those at times based on the malts we're using. But we have done some IPAs over the years, not widely distributed, that did have oats and wheat in them, and they did have a natural haze to them. So when we were looking at a beer that we felt comfortable producing on a national basis, trying to have a lot of yeast present in the beer is tough from a consistency of look. And as the beer sits in somebody's refrigerator, if it's a beer that's got a lot of yeast that contributes to its haze, it'll settle out. It'll start to coagulate and precipitate into larger chunks, and sometimes it can be unattractive to the consumer. So when we wanted to come up with the hazy little thing, we really relied on the natural proteins to create the haze. And so we are using wheat malt and oats in a pretty high percentage, and those do have proteins that don't settle out readily, and so the beer stays hazy from those ingredients, but not necessarily from a lot of yeast that's in the container. And most of the real hazy English style, the East Coast styles do have a very high amount of yeast loading in them.
Yeah.
And they're great when consumed fresh, when the yeast is still in suspension. But as that yeast starts to autolyze and settle, it will create different looks and flavors as it matures. So not as stable of a style. So we didn't want to have a beer with lots and lots of yeast in it that we would then have to have varying levels of consumer concerns when it does so well.
So I'm curious about that, right? Because in the past, having a perfectly clear beer was a badge of honor, I think, for brewers. And now the consumers, or at least a segment of the consumer base, really wants hazy beer. Don't give me that clear beer. Give me the haze. But more than that, the fact that a lot of these aren't shelf stable, that they're not built for the long term, it's a throwback to the early days where beer had to be consumed fresh. Processes and technology have allowed beer to be more shelf stable for a while. Where's the balance for the beer drinker these days between something that can be shipped across the country and still taste fresh versus something that, if you don't drink it within a week from a small tap room, it's gone to pot?
Yeah. Not to denigrate anybody's beer or brewing styles, but one of the things we've strived for years and years is to make as great of a natural conditioned beer that was consistent and flavor stable. And flavor stable isn't a bad thing. I think in our case, we've worked really hard on oxygen control. Any beer, regardless if it's hazy or brilliant, will age based on things like oxygen, heat, light. Those are the enemies of beer. So we've gone back to our brewing roots, and we've looked at what can we do in the brew house to minimize oxygen pickup. Because oxygen throughout the process, even though it may not be immediately denigrating the flavor of the beer, it will take a toll. And so even oxygen ingress at the mashing process will lower the flavor stability of that beer. And so we purge our malt mill with nitrogen. We blanket the grain as we handle it. We strip the oxygen out of our brewing water. Practices that are nuances, probably they don't have huge impacts by themselves, but you add up a number of those practices and your beers will taste better after weeks or months longer based on what you've done throughout the whole process. So we've strived to do that from day one in our brewing, and we continue to look at ways that we can make better beer and have it taste better longer. Freshness is a factor, but also how you handle the beer throughout the whole brewing process and the level of oxygen you pick up during transfer from fermenter to package, that's a big factor. And so all those little things we can focus on and control at a high level, and hopefully produce a beer that's got a lot of character, flavor, and has good shelf stability.
One of the things you mentioned at this dinner last night was you're still bottle conditioning when it comes to pale ale, which I find so fascinating because you probably don't have to do that.
Absolutely don't have to do it
okay.
from technology. I mean, back in 1980, we sort of did.
Right.
I welded the fermenters myself, and they weren't able to hold pressure. And so the only way we could carbonate, and we didn't want to artificially carbonate, we still don't, was to bottle condition. And so all of our beers out of necessity started out being bottle conditioned. Well, now we have tanks that can hold pressure, and we can naturally carbonate in our cellar tanks, and we do that. So our beers are not forced carbonated. We still allow the fermentation process to develop the carbonation in our beers that aren't bottle conditioned. But we do feel that bottle conditioning adds another flavor nuance, another level of character to the beer. Our pale ale, after 2.5-week fermentation and settling process, settled most of the yeast out, we did undergo another 2 weeks of bottle conditioning. And so it's a fairly lengthy process, and most brewers today for a top fermented beer don't have nearly that many days of fermentation and maturation involved. But in order to really keep pale ale true to its roots, we feel bottle conditioning is critical, and we do it for Celebration, Bigfoot, Pale, Porter, Stout, all those beers that we originally bottle conditioned are still bottle conditioned. And that's a good oxygen control measure. So as far as flavor stability, yeast sucks up any excess oxygen that may have gotten in during packaging, and we do feel that gives an added ability of flavor stability, and it does change with time. So as the beer matures, it'll evolve a little bit, but we do feel there's a protection value of the yeast.
It's fair to say that pale ale is an iconic American beer. I mean, it's right up there with Budweiser. It's right up there with so many of these other brands that have become part of the general consciousness. And what's amazing to me to think back that only 40 years ago, or just about 40 years, 38 years or so ago, this beer came onto the scene. And you mentioned last night, I want to go two ways with this. You mentioned last night putting a slide deck together for your employees and reminding them of where the company's place in brewing history was. And you brought up brands and beers that had sort of disappeared from the shelves. What do you see as Pale's contribution to beer in general, and sort of like the importance? And then two, where have we gone with IPA or pale ale since then? I mean, to say nothing of where we are with the New England IPA right now, but there's so many offshoots, and you guys have done them yourselves, and everybody adds everything to pales and to IPAs these days, that your recipe, this original American pale ale, almost seems quaint at some point, and it can be tough to forget the roots. But where do you see Pale's place, and what's your hope for it, and then how do you take what has happened since then, and how far we are removed from that first batch in 1980?
Well, I mean, if you look back at the history of beer in America, a lot of immigrants did bring their traditional styles, and when we were looking at starting Sierra Nevada, we actually went through a bunch of old history books of sort of the history of brewing in America. And you'd find breweries that would have, on the wall of the building, ales, porters, stouts, lagers. So those styles came with some of the immigrants. Ales used to be a big percentage of what was drunk in America. And then as the Germanic influences sort of took over, and we ended up sort of shifting to a lighter style with less character, ales almost disappeared. As a aspiring home brewer, as a home brewer and aspiring commercial brewer back in the late 70s, we really looked at what would be something that would give us a distinctive market appeal, something we could handle technically, because as I mentioned, we really didn't have pressurized fermenters back in those days. And we liked brewing a lot of top fermented beers. I was a fan of stouts and porters, and roasted my own grain as a home brewer, and brewed many of those styles as a home brewer. So I think our pale ale set us apart, and at the time we were one of just a few new brewers in the marketplace, and I think most of us were focused on top fermented beers. think there was only one or two early entrants that made lager beers. Part because of wanting to be different, wanting to sort of be out of the mainstream as far as the style of beer.
Yeah. But then, as far as how far I'll come back to that because when you started in 1980, there was only a handful of breweries in the country, and there was it was sort of a low point for beer.
Right, about 45. I have the old Brewer's Digest from 1981, and I'm assuming it was accurate. It listed every licensed brewery in America, and there was less than 45 breweries or brewing companies. There were a few more breweries because some had multiple plants, but as far as licensed breweries, that was about it in operation at the time. And there were 6 of us that opened up between 1976 when New Albion opened and 1981 when that Brewer's Digest came out.
And there's not many of you left. It's you guys. It's Boulder Beer.
That's it.
Yeah.
So us and Boulder, and then Anchor was an existing brewery, so they really weren't part of that craft wave that started. Although Fritz was certainly producing similar style beers back then.
Do you think it was pale? Was it something else? Was it where you were that allowed you to survive where others didn't? Was it commitment to quality? Was it?
I look back because I was friends with all those guys.
Yeah.
We knew each other on a first name basis. We helped each other out. We got together.
There's 6 of you, so yeah, I'd hope you know first names.
But Fritz would have a party every year at Anchor, and he would invite pretty much all the breweries, small breweries in America, and there was 10, probably in the mid '80s that would come. And he'd have a big barbecue and a party at the Anchor Brewery, and I remember talking and spending some time with a lot of those folks. And it was a number of things. The marketplace wasn't very receptive. It was a hard sell. It was a lot of work. There was really very little money, not enough to survive in many cases. Years later, I talked to Tom DeBacher, who had started DeBacher Brewing. He was a fireman full-time and ran the brewery on the side. Tom Vaughn. There were a number of early brewers that really struggled to make an existence. So I think it was hard. Consistency was a problem as well, though. A number of those breweries did have micro problems or quality control problems that they couldn't at the time either didn't know about, couldn't afford to pull the beer off the market, and it did cause some of those brands to disappear.
We see that even today, though, with 6,000 small breweries in the country right now. I mean, there's still infections that plague brewers. There's still, wrong recipes that show up, or just things that creep in that put, and not in every case, but there is bad beer that gets out into the marketplace. As big as you are, you must still worry about what these smaller brewers are doing and how it can impact the overall industry.
Yeah, it's a big concern, and as part of the Brewer Association, I started the technology group, in part initially focused on draft quality, but it's now expanded into a multifaceted bunch of subcommittees that focus on lots of aspects of brewing quality and consistency, and trying to raise that bar for everyone. There's so much available information today. There's no excuse for a brewer not to be able to find the tools, have the tools, invest in those tools in order to ensure they have a consistent quality. But with 6,000 brewers, there's varying levels of awareness, technology, focus, passion. And so it's something that we need to be diligent about as an industry to make sure that we don't have black eyes happening from bottles blowing up or other quality concerns.
When you first opened, I just want to jump back to this earlier point, but when you first opened, did you think that Pale was going to become a flagship? Because you brewed a porter and a stout early on, and those were the first beers that you made, actually, right? Pale was...
We made stout. Day 1 was stout. Day 3 was Pale.
Okay.
And when we did stout, just because we were trying out the equipment and we knew that making a robust dark beer may hide a few sins a little bit more than a lighter flavored beer, and we had no intention of selling those beers. I think stylistically we realized Pale had the best chance of being our flagship. The stouts and porters were even more out of the mainstream and probably harder for most consumers to switch if you're a lager drinker to jumping into drinking a hoppy stout, which we brewed. So we knew they would have smaller niches. I actually brewed Celebration Ale, our first full year of production, 1981, dry hopped, IPA style, and that was a style I loved as well, and it was something we continued to do and have continued to innovate around.
So these days, though, Pale has just gone so far beyond what you started with in 1980. And I look at who wins at GABF in that category every year. And the beers that are presenting are so far removed flavor-wise. Even just IBU, even just hop content, just everything else as well. We've gotten so far away from some of these classics, and now we're seeing IPAs that have all manners of ingredients in them, from fresh fruit to coffee to everything in between. And you guys make all of these. Do you ever worry, though, about some of these classic styles losing their soul a little bit, or is this part of the natural evolution of beer?
I think it's a natural evolution of beer in some case, but whether it's being driven by the consumer or the brewer or both, as far as pushing the boundaries, it is an American trait to go big, and we're seeing that happen in beer. But I think there's also people who are going to come back to styles that are more drinkable, more quaffable. Our our pale ale was considered an extreme beer back in the early days. Today, it's probably considered a session beer in some people's minds. We still see our pale ale, wins gold medals around the globe as well. It's not going to stand out in a pale ale tasting at the GABF, because you're right, the pale ales that are entered in those categories today are a far cry from sort of the classic pale ale that we pioneered with moderate hopping and moderate alcohol.
Does that, bother you at all that it's moved so far away?
Well, we've seen some of the beers that have won in the pale ale categories are really IPAs, and some of them are marketed as IPAs, so it's a little bit disingenuous. If you want to stand out in a category, being on the extreme end of it is probably going to be a help. But we're not going to change our pale ale to change with how the market's changed. We're going to introduce new beers to satisfy people who want to drink those styles. But we really think the pale ale is still an amazing beer, and I drink it regularly, and we have consumers, that's what they prefer out of all of our lineup. So some people's tastes aren't as extreme and do want to have a beer that they can have 2 or 3 or 4 of in a session and enjoy an evening with friends talking.
One of the things you mentioned earlier was the R&D beers, and I think that when you talk to brewers, or when I talk to brewers across the country, the thing that they're always amazed at is the beers that Sierra Nevada puts out on a national scale. And Otravez a few years ago, a few years ago, rolling out a national Goza was really kind of remarkable for what was still then an obscure style, and you could argue is still kind of an obscure style these days. And that was taking a huge risk on your part, I imagine.
It was a gamble, yep.
Yeah.
And we thought it was going to be a little bit of a gamble, and maybe we were too ahead of the curve on that. We actually put in a huge amount of infrastructure to make those beers. We built lactic cellars, so we have separate fermentation halls at both breweries, where we naturally produce a lactic brew. So it was quite an investment, and we had a vision that we thought that style would be one that would grow as people appreciate sours and more tart beers. We're using those lactic cultures in other ways, so some of that natural lactic fermentation is showing up in beers that don't have any mention of stylistically a Goza or something. So we're using a little bit of a tart wort in order to add some flavor nuances to some other beers as well.
But for a brewery your size, so 1 million plus barrels of beer a year, it must be harder to be proactive rather than reactive, right? To see what's happening on a smaller scale and then saying, well, yeah, let's go do that too. But a lot of the beers that you guys put out and that you have put out seem to be just ahead of the curve. And the No Middle Ground coffee IPA that came out, I was part of the beer camp team that did that, years ago.
Yep.
And just forward-thinking things like that, like Kellerweiss a few years ago as well, which is still one of my favorite beers that you guys make.
Actually, Kellerweiss, I envisioned brewing that about 25 years ago, truthfully. I was in Europe buying some equipment, and I fell in love with that style. And I came back to my team, and I want to say it was probably in the late 80s, and wanted to do a traditional beer like our Kellerweiss, and I was shut down a bit by my team, and I do sometimes listen, saying, geez, it's not going to go over in this country. Those flavor nuances, the clove, that's not a style that's going to find wide favor. And so we shelved it and produced a wheat beer that had a more conventional flavor profile with a top fermented yeast that didn't express all that character. So it was something I really felt strongly about, but not enough to sort of take that risk at the time.
But when you have taken the risk, and has there ultimately been reward, and maybe not even sales-wise, but isn't it the nature of the brewers to always just be trying to steer the public towards new flavors?
I think Kellerweiss is a prime example of one that gets lots of accolades, does well in tastings. We put it up against most German beers of the same style, and we've done well. But as far as market success, it's not hugely successful. But it's a beer style I drink regularly. I'll order those at our pubs quite often. It's refreshing. It's not too high in alcohol. It's a great beer to sit down and enjoy. And it's in North Carolina. It can be our number 2 seller out of all the beers we have there in that marketplace. It finds great favor because it is not too flavor intensive.
Pale aside, if there was one beer that you guys make that you're going to be stocked in your fridge for the rest of your days, what would it be?
I'd say seasonally a little bit it varies. So Celebration is one that holds a place in my heart, and when we're brewing Celebration, it's what I mainly drink.
Okay. You mentioned being in Europe and buying equipment. You've rescued a lot of copper from various parts of Europe, various parts of the world, and you've also forged a connection with brewers and brewing traditions overseas. There was a few years ago that you were doing the Abbey-style ales with the monks not too far from...
Still doing those.
Okay.
Still doing those from some Belgium influence there, and those have been fun to do. We've worked with, actually, the Gutmann Brewery is where our Kellerweiss yeast came from, and a brewery that we've got a good relationship and is famous for that style. And we've worked with Rigola and Oktoberfest and quite a few other breweries as well.
Well, and that's the interesting thing on the Oktoberfest beers, this is where I was going, is you've been working with family breweries over in Germany to bring out a new Oktoberfest each year. Tradition is still important, and I think that we forget our history sometimes when we're always looking for the next big shiny thing. But you've been able to kind of keep the brewery focused on the past, on the traditions, while looking forward. But what's the importance there of tradition?
I think tradition is important from a lot of reasons. I mean, certainly on the brewing heritage and knowledge and styles and as you mentioned, we've worked with a lot of family-owned breweries in Europe as well, so that's fun to do. For us, having those connections opens our eyes, opens their eyes. We've found not all German brewers are open to the concept of collaborating with an American brewer, but many of the ones that are, have great brewing traditions and really a lot of knowledge about beer, and they bring old ingredients that may be new to us and processes. So we've learned a lot, and I think some of the brewers have as well. So it's really a two-way collaboration. A lot of those German breweries are looking for things that'll make their businesses stronger, even though some of them may be 400 or 500 years old right now or even older. They still need to stay relevant, and so those partnerships have really brought something to both sides.
For your 30th anniversary, you did a series of beers with your beer heroes, Fritz Maytag, Charlie Papazian, Fred Eckhart, who is a great writer, the dean of beer writers in the U.S., and Jack McAuliffe, the original microbrewer. these days, and last night at this dinner, we heard one brewer after another get up and just sort of marvel that they were sitting in the same room as you, and you being responsible for their career or inspiring your beers, inspiring careers. And I think that there's a whole swath of generation of brewers and beer drinkers who will say the exact same thing. What's the question you get most often from young brewers? Because you must seek out a lot of advice, or you must be sought out for advice.
A lot of them weren't even born when I was started out. So I think there's a little bit of how did you do this? What was it like? What were your challenges? They're much different today than they were back then. As I mentioned last night, for us it was educating the retailers, getting an account to put your beer on tap was really hard. We got some distributors lined up, probably our second year in business. We self-distributed ourselves, or we still do, but that's how we started. And as we started to expand into the Bay Area and other markets, just convincing somebody to put your beer on tap or to put it on the shelf was not easy. And we had one employee who was our salesman and helped out around the brewery, Steve Harrison. And I remember him coming back from spending 4 or 5 days in the Bay Area, day after day getting shut down. Maybe he'd get one placement. Really tough sell. So I think for us, those early days are different than the challenges that the brewer faces today.
Right.
Not that they're less challenges, but I mean today it's still getting attention from wholesalers and retailers because there's so many choices. You don't have the educating consumer issues as much as we did. I mean, back then craft beer was an unknown. Today, most consumers, I think, have heard of craft beer or certainly heard. So a lot of the questions around, how did we do it? How did we grow our business? How did we stay independent?
Independence, that's the key word these days. We've sort of moved away from craft a little bit, and we're talking about independence. So essentially meaning not owned by a larger brewery like Heineken or ABI or any of the others out there. On your packaging for the last couple of years since you bought out your original partner in the brewery, you've been saying family owned and operated. And now I saw on the can last night, it's family owned, operated, and argued over. Let's get to the argued over part first.
So I've got my daughter and son. I have 3 children. 2 of them are involved in the business, and my daughter's in Chico and works with me, and my son's out in North Carolina, but makes many trips to Chico as well. So it's a family dynamic. So we talk about a lot of aspects of the business, and for years I was pretty much the dictator, and it was my way, and I didn't have a lot of outside influences. Now that the family's involved, and our goal is to have the brewery be multi-generational, they've got differences of opinion from me as well as from each other, and so we have good discussions around direction and leadership of the company. Not that we argue, but there are times when my team's sitting around and it's my 2 kids and me debating something, and it's, I think, overall a healthy situation. But I think most people who have families and family businesses can relate to the fact that sometimes not everybody is totally in agreement on everything.
And it is the plan that the brewery will go to your kids, to the next generation?
If they're willing and able, that would be the goal. They're certainly involved. And we've got other management outside of the family, and they're playing a major role in the direction of the company as well. But it would be nice to have it be a multi-generational business. I visit brewers in Europe that are on their 15th or 20th generation, and they've had their ups and downs, but some of them are still doing quite well.
Is there a scenario where you think the brewery could go to another company, to be it another craft brewer, be it a larger brewing company, be it like a larger outside entity? We've seen some of the financial firms come in and make major investments and sort of take over brewing operations. Is that door totally closed, or is there always...
Well, the future is unknown, so it's hard to say what's going to happen. But our intent and our goal, we've had plenty of opportunities to, sell the business to all of those kinds of entities, large brewers, to foreign brewers, to venture funds. Many of the brewers that do have those partners today, some of them, it was forced, not due to their plan, but they got into a financial situation where they had too much leverage or needed additional resources to grow what they thought was the way they wanted to grow. I've talked to many of them over the years, and I think people who have gone public, who've taken in venture money, have over-leveraged with banks. Most of them have regrets. I don't think it's turned out the way they envisioned in all those cases. In some cases, maybe it has. Maybe it was the right strategy for them. I'm not putting anybody down for making those choices.
No, of course.
They've made their business decisions, and it may be well within what they planned.
As somebody, though, who is... you're also a champion of this industry, and you're friends with a lot of these people. I think when Anchor sold a few years ago, and then again recently, that felt personal for a lot of folks because they were considered to be the original craft brand, because Fritz Maytag had done so much to help your generation of brewers out and countless others along there. Do you see it that way? Is it, when you remove the business from it, do you go back in time in your mind a little bit, and not part of your childhood dies, but it's...
Fritz did what he thought was the right legacy for his business. I don't think it worked out exactly how he envisioned it. I don't think he anticipated that there would be another sale of the business after the initial sale. He didn't have a family member, I think, that was in a position to take the brewery over and keep it multi-generational. I know he kept his cheese company that was his grandfather, I think, had started. And that, I think, was going to be his family legacy more so than the brewery. The brewing business is challenging on a lot of fronts, and if you don't have anybody who really is in line to steward it and has all the resources, you've got to make a decision what to do. Fritz was in his 70s.
On the business front of things, removing the beer for a second, what's the biggest challenge that your company faces?
The marketplace today has got a lot of headwinds, and the consolidation at the top certainly creates challenges for distribution, for retail shelf space, for the ability to get your beer in front of consumers, as well as from the bottom with just the sheer number of beers and brands that are on the shelves. That creates challenges as well. So we're in a very competitive industry. The brewing industry always has been. We're at a unique place right now with still lots of entrants coming in and lots of surplus capacity across the many parts of the segment. The big brewers have too much capacity, and some of the mid-size and regional brewers have built capacity in anticipation of continued double-digit growth, which hasn't been happening. And so the next few years will be interesting to watch.
Mills River came online at just the right time, right? You guys were you led the charge, it seems, to the East Coast. It would be much more difficult today to pull that off, given the marketplace, right?
Definitely. So in 2010 is when we decided to build in Mills River, and we had been thinking about it for years. And we were really pretty over capacity in Chico. We were brewing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it was really stressful, the whole operation. And we had seen the handwriting on the wall for years about carbon footprint and logistics and shipping and having a single West Coast shipping point and being a national brand. So we knew we had to do something, and so we had planned on a Mills River or at least an eastern expansion for quite a few years, and had put it on the back burner many times, just due to what we considered the complexities and challenges of having two sites and keeping the culture together and all the issues that being on two coasts create. But by 2010, we thought it was time. We started a site search. We broke ground in 2012 in Mills River. I know other brewers who have announced geographic expansions have put them on the back burner from what I can tell, and they probably will never happen, or not too many of them.
Because the marketplace changed so fast in such a short period of time.
It did, yeah. Both the competitive landscape as well as just the sheer volume growth that we were seeing across the segment. Both of those have been some headwinds for a lot of aspiring national players.
It's interesting. I've been to Mills River twice now, and each time I've just shown up, and there's always brewers who are coming in. It's a pilgrimage, I think, for a lot of folks as well, in the same way that your brewery in Chico is. And it's hard for brewers to suppress smiles when they walk through, because it is just a perfect brewery on just about every level. And Malt Disney World is the nickname that I guess some folks have given it. And it's certainly worth, even just for a fan to come through. But Platinum LEED certification for the brewery, and people sometimes forget that brewing is a huge consumer of energy. The brewing process, there's a lot of waste associated with it as well. And from the early days, you've been very environmentally conscious as to how the brewery is perceived and how the brewery acts as well. Why? I know why it's important, but I want to hear from you. Why go for Platinum LEED? Why you've installed pieces of equipment? I know out in Chico you have your hot rot. There's this giant composting machine that when I was talking to some of your employees back in the day, they're like, nobody needs this. The cost of this is insane, but Ken wanted it, and so we got it, and they say it with this sort of begrudging admiration, as it were. But this is important to you, right? This is a personal push.
As we've grown, I've tried to look at what we can do that is more sustainable, uses resources better. The hot rod's an interesting one. We were throwing away. We had a big restaurant. We were dumping lots of tubs of lettuce scraps and plate scraps, and I've been a composter at home for years. I've had worms and compost piles and chickens for the last 40 years. And so for me, it was like, geez, we should be able to do something better with this. And I started investigating composting systems and ended up with the hot rod. It was one of those investments that did not have an ROI. But today, actually, our community in the state of California is starting to force composting of restaurant waste. There's just no place in our community to get it done. We're really a bit ahead of the curve on that one. But it makes no sense to landfill things that have a lot of nutritional value for worms, which then can go fertilize gardens, and so it just seems like we closed the circle. In Mills River, we had the opportunity to really build the dream brewery, and looking at how to do it in a sustainable fashion, both on the construction side. We didn't start out thinking we were going to get LEED Platinum. We wanted to be LEED certified. We were initially going for silver, and then thought, let's see if we can get to gold. And then as we went through the process, we started getting closer and closer to having a platinum certification. So then midway through the project, let's go all the way. Let's see if we can really get to platinum. And it was quite an exercise. Not easy, not inexpensive. Probably, in hindsight, whether or not I would have jumped through all the hurdles to get to platinum, I don't know. But we're pleased and proud that we did it. But it did add a lot of complexity to the project, and required a level of diligence on the construction side and use of materials and paint and carpeting, and we would have gotten there easier. We actually cut down some trees on the site. We ended up milling, kiln drying, and using all those trees back in the construction. But as it turns out, they did not count because they weren't certified by the Steward Council. So we lost points in areas that we thought we were doing a pretty good thing by utilizing all the wood from the site in the construction. But that was not something that was easy to get certified through the LEED process.
Not every small brewery is going to have those resources or even have the inclination, but What's one or two things that some of these other smaller breweries of the 6,000 that are out there these days, or even home brewers, can do to just start making a better impact on the environment around them?
I mean, there's a ton you can do that's very inexpensive, and I've given many talks over the years around these subjects, and things as simple as putting your cooling and heating and air conditioning systems on a regular PM process, so that you're cleaning condensers, you're looking at really simple things that might save you 10, 15, 20% of your energy costs that don't cost you anything. I mean, a little bit of labor and a little bit of focus. Air compressors are a big source of energy, and a lot of people have air leaks all over their facilities. I've been to many commercial plants that you can hear air hissing all over the place. Mm-hmm. They're running 50 or 100 or even more horsepower worth of air compressors and losing 10, 20, 30% of that. So there's some real basics. Lighting, obviously, today, a lot of options with super efficient lighting. Using heat, recovered heat efficiently. Lots of places to capture waste heat. Again, air compressors generate a lot of heat. You can heat buildings with that waste heat. We have lots of heat recapture stuff. That there is some initial cost, but paybacks would be great in the long term.
I heard a story a couple of years ago of when I was out in Chico, and how you show up at the brewery pretty early most mornings and would go and grab the maintenance log and see if there's one or two things you could do before the staff came in. Do you still walk around the brewery? Do you still touch the equipment and yeah?
Much to the chagrin of some of my staff, but no, I jump in on all sorts of projects, and I still am active in the engineering side of the brewery. We have an engineering department at both breweries with really talented people, but I still, that's the kind of stuff I love. Brewing is an art and a science, and it's a lot of problem solving, and for me that's where the heart of my passion comes down to, whether it's problem solving around a beer or brewing or raw materials or a piece of equipment. I still like getting in there and trying to help.
Is that it must ground you in some ways as well, right? Because running two large breweries and the way that you do, your day could just be filled with phone calls and emails and handshake meetings and et cetera, et cetera. Is there a Zen-like component to getting back into the brew house?
For me, staying current on brewing and brewing science and what's happening in the industry is still really important. So I read a lot. I subscribe to lots of journals and industry information, and I try to stay current on the science of brewing, the technology of brewing, as well as sort of what's happening in the industry. And I think if I lose that, then I lose the connection to sort of how I got here and what's kept me going all these years.
On the science of brewing topic, Sierra Nevada has been instrumental in hop research and putting forward research grants and working with growers to really move hops forward. Where are things headed in hop research? We've come such a far way in a short period of time.
Yeah, we have. We're still very involved in that, and we have a raw materials team, and we've got a couple of folks there who are passionate about hops and barley, and so we're involved in American Barley Association, American Malt Barley Association, the Canadian Association. We're working with maltsters on some R&D projects, so we've got actually direct collaborations on kilning projects. We've got still pretty sophisticated lab resources, so we've got gas chromatographs and things focused that really help us help the growers as well as some of the malt breeders and the maltsters. We like the science of beer, and hops obviously are part of our DNA. So we'll continue to work directly with growers. We're always doing nano brews. That's part of where our nano brewery comes in. We're working with a lot of numbered hop varieties, doing hop research pretty much every week. We're doing something with new hop varieties.
You mentioned, the art and science of beer, and I think that the art gets a lot of the focus, a lot of the time, but that the science is often overlooked by the consumer.
It's overlooked by some brewers, unfortunately, as well, that I talk to that don't want to be bothered to dig into the science. They think they can be artists and use the materials without really understanding some aspects of it, and that can be done to some degree. But as we talked about earlier, having best practices to make that beer taste great for days, weeks, or months longer by paying attention to things like oxygen pickup or handling or iron levels in the water or the equipment or copper. Some of those trace nuances of science do affect your overall flavor stability and making a beer that's going to taste the same batch after batch.
We have a more savvy consumer base these days, and so when there are brewers that aren't paying attention to this, do you think that can hurt the overall industry? Do you think that we'll start to... I hate talking about a shakeout or a bubble burst or things like that, but we do have a more savvy consumer base these days. And there's certain things that certain brewers are doing that will put them out of business just because that's the natural progression of things.
Yeah, again, the brewing business is very competitive, and I think the consumer is much more savvy. And if you miss the mark time after time, or if the consumer has a bad experience because last time I had it tasted great, this time it doesn't taste so good, it will have a certain attrition that's caused just based on consistency and quality that the consumer begins to expect. Having an artist's approach where the beer can be different every single time only goes so far until somebody really finds something they don't like, and then it becomes brand killing. So I think being able to produce what you want to produce the same time and time again is a part of the brewer's art and skill. We sometimes look at wineries as having a scapegoat. Well, the grapes weren't as good this year. As a brewer, your job in a lot of ways is to try to take those raw materials and use them in a way where you can gain some consistency and reproducibility, and not blame the beer not turning out on the hop crop or the barley crop. The consumer may accept that, but I think a lot of consumers don't want to accept a product that's changing every time.
As we start to wrap up here, I want to ask you, what's your hope for beer?
We've come so far. The U.S. is still leading the charge, I think, and we will probably continue to lead the charge on a global basis as far as innovation, creativity. The consumer is either coming along or driving a lot of that. We heard last night at the dinner that you got places like Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, Washington, and San Diego, where 1/3 of the beer or more is craft beer, and that would have been something when I started that I would have said that was impossible. So we've really changed the dynamic of beer in America, and I continue to see that happening and furthering around the whole country and around the globe.
Ken Grossman is the president and the owner of the Sierra Nevada Brewing Company, with breweries in Chico, California, and Mills River, North Carolina. You can read more about the story of the brewery. We didn't get into nearly enough of the history in his book called Beyond the Pale, The Story of Sierra Nevada Brewing Company, where fine books are sold. Ken, thank you so much for sitting down. This was a real privilege.
It's been a pleasure, and great seeing you again, and look forward to crossing paths in the future.
Absolutely. You can learn more about Sierra Nevada and brewing in general by visiting beerandbrewing.com. There you can subscribe to the magazine, subscribe to this podcast, and learn more about how to be a better home brewer. You can also reach out to me at John Hall, JOHNHOLL, at beerandbrewing.com, or follow the conversation on Twitter at John_Hall. And we will be back again next week with an all-new episode. Thank you so much for listening. Cheers.
This episode is brought to you by GEA. Around the world, every second liter of beer is brewed with the aid of systems and processes from GEA because their solutions address even the smallest details of the brewing process. GEA's range of services include everything from engineering, manufacturing, delivery, installation, automation, servicing, and more. At GEA, their goal is to help brewers make more beer of the highest quality in a cost-efficient and sustainable manner. To learn more, visit GEA.com and be sure to follow the GEA Craft Brewing page on Facebook. This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.